War is a crucible. It melts down nations, armies, and individual souls, stripping them to their essential elements. In the inferno of the Second World War, two radically different philosophies of human value were tested on the battlefield, not by politicians or philosophers, but by the men who had to live and die by them. This is the story of two such realities, embodied by two starkly different instruments of war. A bag of life-giving plasma in the hands of an American medic, and a Commissar's pistol, aimed not at the enemy, but at his own. June 6, 1944, Omaha Beach. The air is thick with the metallic taste of blood and the acrid smell of cordite. Private First Class Charles Norman Shea, a medic with the 1st Infantry Division, crawls through the blood-soaked sand. He is 19 years old. All around him is the cacophony of slaughter. Men are cut down in the surf, their bodies tossed by the waves like driftwood. Others lie maimed and screaming on the beach. Shea ignores the bullets cracking overhead. His focus is singular. A wounded soldier, half submerged in the reddening water, his life pouring out from a dozen shrapnel wounds. Shea doesn't have morphine, not yet, but he has something arguably more vital in that moment, a plasma kit. He rips open the packaging, his hands shaking but his movements practiced. A bottle of distilled water, another of dried plasma. He punctures the vials, mixes the life-sustaining fluid, and inserts the needle into the dying man's arm. He holds the bottle aloft, a makeshift IV pole in the midst of hell, and watches as the pale, translucent liquid flows into the soldier's veins. It is a desperate, almost hopeless act of defiance against the overwhelming tide of death. For this medic, for this army, the life of this one man in this maelstrom of destruction is worth fighting for. 2 years earlier, August 28, 1942, the outskirts of Stalingrad, the German 6th Army is tightening its iron grip on the city. A Red Army rifle company, decimated by days of relentless fighting, attempts a tactical withdrawal from a shattered trench line. Among them is a young private, barely a man, his leg mangled by a mortar blast. He stumbles, falls, and cries out to his comrades to help him. But they can't. They are running for their own lives. From a hastily dug command post, a figure emerges. He wears the uniform of a junior political commissar, an officer of the Communist Party. He walks with a chillingly calm demeanor to the wounded soldier. There is no medical kit in his hand. There is only a Tokarev TT-33 pistol. He looks down at the writhing boy, not with pity, but with a cold, pragmatic fury. This soldier is no longer a fighter. He is an impediment, a symbol of the retreat and panic that Stalin has personally forbidden. The commissar raises his pistol. The soldier looks up, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. A single shot rings out across the steppe. The boy's body goes still. The commissar turns and walks back to his post. His duty done. These two moments, a world apart in distance, but simultaneous in the grand, brutal timeline of the Second World War, were not accidents. They were not the isolated actions of a hero and a villain. They were the direct, inevitable products of two fundamentally different military philosophies, two clashing ideologies that valued the individual soldier in starkly opposing ways. This is the story of a philosophy of preservation versus a philosophy of expenditure. It is the duel between an American medic's plasma, a symbol of the immense effort to save a single life, and a Soviet commissar's bullet, a tool to enforce discipline through the ultimate act of pragmatism. This is the story of how that choice, made in the highest echelons of power and carried out on the blood-soaked earth of Normandy and Stalingrad, defined the fate of millions.
To understand why a young American would risk his life to administer plasma while a Soviet officer would take a life to enforce an order, We must look beyond the battlefield. We must examine the very DNA of the armies they served. For the American military of the Second World War, the approach to its soldiers was a complex mixture of democratic idealism and cold, hard pragmatism. The United States entered the war as an industrial powerhouse, a nation that prided itself on its technological prowess and its reverence for the individual. This wasn't just a matter of lofty principle, it was a strategic calculation. American military planners understood that their greatest asset was not an inexhaustible supply of manpower, but a well-trained, well-equipped, and highly motivated fighting force. Each soldier represented a significant investment in time, training, and resources. To lose a soldier was not just a human tragedy, it was a strategic loss. This philosophy manifested in the doctrine of the U.S. Army Medical Corps. The goal was not just to win battles, but to win them with the minimum possible loss of life. This led to an unprecedented emphasis on medical innovation and logistics. The development and mass production of penicillin, the widespread use of sulfa drugs, and, most importantly, the implementation of a blood plasma program were all part of this overarching strategy. Plasma, which could be dried, transported, and administered far forward on the battlefield, became a cornerstone of this effort. Medics were trained not just in basic first aid, but in the administration of this life-saving substance, pushing the boundaries of medical care right up to the front lines. The message to the American GI was clear: you are valuable, your life is worth saving, and the entire weight of American industry and ingenuity will be brought to bear to bring you home. The Soviet Union's reality was forged in a different fire. The Red Army was born from the ashes of revolution and civil war, shaped by decades of Bolshevik ideology and the brutal pragmatism of Stalinist rule. The core of this ideology was the supremacy of the collective over the individual. The state, the motherland, was everything. The individual was a cog in the vast machine of the revolution, expendable in the service of the greater good. This philosophy was brutally reinforced by the realities of the Eastern Front. Facing a technologically superior and initially overwhelming German invasion, the Soviets' most abundant resource was people. Stalin's strategy was often one of trading space for time and bodies for victory. Casualties were not just expected, they were factored into the strategic calculus on an industrial scale. This philosophy was enshrined in orders that would be infamous in the West. Order 270, issued in August 1941, declared that any soldier who surrendered would be considered a traitor, and their families would be subject to arrest. But the most notorious was Order number 227, issued in July 1942 as the Wehrmacht pushed towards Stalingrad. Known as the Not a Step Back Order, it explicitly forbade any retreat without direct orders. To enforce this, it created two new types of units: penal battalions, filled with soldiers accused of disciplinary problems and sent on near-suicidal missions, and blocking detachments. These were special units of the NKVD, the secret police, positioned behind the front lines with orders to shoot any soldier who tried to retreat. The Commissar, the political officer attached to every unit, was the embodiment of this doctrine at a micro level. His primary duty was not the welfare of the soldiers, but their political reliability and their unwavering obedience to the will of the party. In this context, a wounded soldier who could no longer fight was not a comrade to be saved, but a potential source of panic and dissent. Executing him was not murder, it was a necessary act of military discipline. The point of divergence between these two philosophies can be traced back to their very origins. The American military, for all its flaws, was an extension of a democratic society that, in principle, valued individual rights and human life. The Red Army was the instrument of a totalitarian state that saw its people as a resource to be expended in the pursuit of its ideological goals. The war did not create these philosophies, it simply provided them with the ultimate, brutal stage on which to play out their consequences. For the American soldier, the medic with his plasma kit was a promise that his country would do everything in its power to bring him home. For the Soviet soldier, the Commissar with his pistol was a stark reminder that the motherland demanded his life, one way or another.
The chasm between these two realities is most starkly revealed when we dissect the official policies and the lived experiences of the soldiers on the ground. It is a story told in medical manuals and military orders, in the ink of personal diaries and the fading memories of veterans. Let's begin with official policy. The United States Army entered World War II with a medical doctrine that was an evolution of its experiences in the First World War. It was a system built on a chain of evacuation, designed to move a wounded soldier from the point of injury to increasingly sophisticated levels of care as quickly as possible. The linchpin of this system, at the sharp end, was the company aid man, the medic. His equipment was a testament to the American philosophy of preservation. The standard medic's kit included morphine syrettes for pain, sulfur powder as an antiseptic, and dozens of bandages and compresses. But the revolutionary tool was the M1944 plasma kit. Contained in a waterproof bag were two vials, one with dried blood plasma, the other with sterilized water. The medic was trained to mix and administer this on the spot, a procedure that could stabilize a soldier suffering from shock and blood loss, buying him the precious minutes needed to survive the journey to the next echelon of care. The U.S. Army Medical Department's official publications, like the Guides to Therapy for Medical Officers, emphasized the importance of treating shock as a primary, life-threatening condition with plasma as the foremost tool in that fight. On the Soviet side, the official policy was far grimmer. While the Red Army did have a medical corps, it was chronically under-equipped and overwhelmed by the sheer scale of casualties on the Eastern Front. Soviet military doctrine prioritized the rapid return of lightly wounded soldiers to the front. Severely wounded soldiers often faced a grim triage, with limited resources allocated to those with the best chance of becoming effective combatants again. But the most chilling aspect of Soviet official policy was not found in its medical manuals, but in its disciplinary orders. Order 227 was not a suggestion, it was the law of the front. It stated unequivocally, panic-mongers and cowards should be exterminated in place. This gave commissars and commanders the explicit authority to shoot any soldier who retreated without orders. While the order was ostensibly aimed at routing units, its application on the ground could be far more arbitrary. The line between a tactical retreat and panic-mongering was often a thin one, and the decision rested in the hands of a political officer whose own life might be forfeit if his unit broke. This policy created a reality where the greatest immediate threat to a Soviet soldier was not always the German machine gun to his front, but the blocking detachment to his rear. These policies were not just words on paper. They shaped the daily terrifying reality of the soldiers. Let's hear it in their own words. From the diary of an American medic in the European theater. Saw a kid today. Couldn't have been more than 18. Shrapnel from a mortar tore him up bad. He was going into shock. His skin cold and clammy. I got the plasma into him and just held his hand. I kept telling him, "You're going to make it, kid. You're going home." I don't know if he heard me, but I saw a little bit of color come back to his cheeks. Maybe it was the plasma. Maybe it was just having someone there. But for a few minutes, he wasn't just another casualty. He was a person, and we were fighting to save him. Contrast this with a passage from the memoirs of a former Red Army soldier who fought at Stalingrad. We were ordered to attack a German position across an open field. It was madness. Our comrades were cut down in waves. A boy from my village, he was hit in the stomach. He was screaming for his mother. Our Commissar, a man with eyes like chips of ice, walked over to him. He didn't say a word. He just shot him. We all saw it. Later he told us, "The motherland has no use for cowards." His cries were bad for morale. We did not look at each other. We just stared ahead. We understood. We were not men. We were bullets to be fired at the enemy. And if we misfired, we would be discarded. Now let's consider the strategic impact. The American approach, while costly in terms of resources, paid significant dividends. The high value placed on a soldier's life fostered a powerful sense of trust between the men and their leaders. A soldier was more likely to take calculated risks, to fight with greater tenacity, if he believed that every effort would be made to save him if he fell. This ethos also had a profound effect on morale. The knowledge that a world-class medical system was standing by to treat them was a powerful psychological comfort. Furthermore, the American system was remarkably effective at returning wounded soldiers to the fight. By saving lives at the front, the U.S. Army was not just acting humanely, it was conserving its most valuable combat resource, trained and experienced soldiers. The Soviet approach was, in its own brutal way, also strategically effective, at least in the short term. The draconian discipline imposed by the commissars and blocking detachments undoubtedly stiffened the resolve of many Soviet units, particularly in the desperate days of 1941 and 1942. When faced with the choice between a near-certain death in a suicidal charge and a guaranteed death for retreating, many chose to charge. This willingness to absorb astronomical casualties allowed the Soviet command to trade lives for time, grinding down the German war machine through sheer attrition. However, this brutality came at a terrible cost. It fostered a culture of fear and mistrust, and it led to staggering losses that would leave the Soviet Union demographically scarred for generations. The Commissar's bullet may have plugged a gap in the line for a day, but the philosophy it represented bled the Red Army of millions of men who, under a different system, might have been saved to fight another day. It was a strategy of desperation, a brutal answer to a desperate situation, but one that left an indelible stain on the Red Army's ultimate victory.
When the guns fell silent and the smoke cleared, the consequences of these two opposing philosophies were laid bare. The verdict of history is written not just in the outcome of the war, but in the cold, hard data of survival and the lasting psychological scars of those who fought it. The immediate consequences of these divergent approaches were evident in the heat of battle. At the Battle of the Bulge, for instance, American medics performed extraordinary feats of bravery, often under direct fire, to stabilize and evacuate their wounded comrades. This had a tangible effect on the fighting spirit of the American units. Surrounded and outnumbered, American soldiers held their ground, in part because of the faith they had in their medics and the medical system behind them. The will to fight is fortified by the belief that your life is not being thrown away needlessly. In contrast, during the Rzhev meat grinder, a series of brutal and largely unsuccessful Soviet offensives in 1942 and 1943, the Commissar's bullet was a constant presence. Soldiers were driven forward in human wave attacks against heavily fortified German positions. The blocking detachments behind them ensured that there was no retreat. While this approach did manage to tie down significant German forces, the cost was almost unimaginable.
Soviet casualties in the battles for the Rzhev salient are estimated to be well over 1 million men killed, wounded, or missing. The immediate consequence was a battlefield where the fear of one's own side was often as potent as the fear of the enemy. This created a brittle form of courage, one based on terror rather than conviction. The long-term consequences are even telling. The American philosophy of valuing the individual soldier had a profound impact on the post-war era. The creation of the GI Bill, the massive investment in veterans' healthcare, and the cultural veneration of the greatest generation were all extensions of the promise made on the battlefield, that the nation would care for those who fought for it. This approach helped to create a more stable and prosperous post-war society. The soldiers who came home, though scarred by their experiences, were largely reintegrated into civilian life, their sacrifices acknowledged and, to a degree, repaid. The American system, by striving to save its soldiers, also saved its future. For the Soviet Union, the long-term consequences of its philosophy of expenditure were devastating. The country had won the war, but at a cost that is still difficult to comprehend. The Soviet Union lost an estimated 27 million people, both soldiers and civilians, during the war. The generation of men who fought and died in their millions was virtually wiped out. This demographic catastrophe had long-lasting effects on Soviet society, its economy, and its psyche. Furthermore, the brutal methods used to achieve victory left a legacy of trauma and cynicism. The soldiers who survived had witnessed the state's utter disregard for their lives. This experience hardened a generation, fostering a deep-seated distrust of authority that would simmer beneath the surface of Soviet society for decades. The victory was glorious, but the methods used to achieve it poisoned the well for the generations that followed. But the most unimpeachable verdict comes from the numbers. Let's look at the hard data. For the United States military in the European theater of operations, if a soldier was wounded, he had an astonishingly high chance of survival. Thanks to the combination of rapid evacuation, plasma, sulfa drugs, and penicillin, the mortality rate for wounded American soldiers who reached a medical facility was less than 4.5%. This was a revolutionary leap in military medicine, a direct result of the immense resources dedicated to saving individual lives. The statistics for the Red Army are far more grim and, due to the nature of the Soviet state, less precise. However, most historians agree that the number of Soviet military dead was somewhere between 8.7 and 11.4 million. The total number of wounded is estimated to be around 15 million. While the Soviet Medical Corps did perform heroically under impossible conditions and managed to return a high percentage of the lightly wounded to service, the sheer number of men who were killed outright, died of their wounds before reaching care, or were executed for disciplinary reasons is on a completely different scale. While direct statistical comparisons are difficult, the overall casualty figures tell a clear story. The American military, with a total of around 416,000 killed in all theaters of the war, fought a conflict that was an order of magnitude less costly in human life than the one fought by the Soviet Union. The American philosophy of preservation, backed by industrial might, resulted in one of the most effective life-saving systems in the history of warfare. The Soviet philosophy of expenditure, born of ideological ruthlessness and desperate necessity, resulted in a victory that was almost indistinguishable from a national tragedy.
The stark contrast between a medic's plasma and a commissar's bullet is more than just a historical anecdote. It is a profound lesson in the nature of warfare and the ideologies that drive it. It reveals a fundamental truth. How an army treats its own soldiers is a direct reflection of the society it fights for. The American effort to save a single soldier, no matter how costly or difficult, was an affirmation of the democratic ideal that the individual has inherent worth. It was a declaration that the nation existed to serve its people, not the other way around. This belief, practiced under the most extreme circumstances imaginable, was a powerful weapon in its own right. It fostered loyalty, courage, and a resilience that could not be coerced at the point of a gun. The Soviet Commissar's bullet, on the other hand, was the ultimate expression of a totalitarian ideology. It proclaimed that the individual was meaningless in the face of the state's will. It was a tool of control that substituted fear for loyalty and terror for morale. While this brutal calculus contributed to the defeat of Nazi Germany, a victory for which the world owes the Soviet people an immeasurable debt, it did so by consuming the very people it claimed to be liberating. The tragedy of the Eastern Front is that millions had to die, not just at the hands of the enemy, but at the behest of their own leaders, to secure a victory that would usher in decades more of totalitarian rule. This comparison does not seek to diminish the heroism of the individual Red Army soldier. Their sacrifice and tenacity in the face of the Nazi war machine were nothing short of superhuman. But it forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth, that the philosophies that guide nations in wartime have real, tangible, and often devastating consequences. The choice between a culture of preservation and a culture of expenditure is not merely a matter of strategy. It is a moral decision with consequences that ripple through generations. It is the difference between an army that fights to protect its people and an army that uses its people as fuel for the fire of war. In the final analysis, a nation's true strength is not measured by its willingness to sacrifice its soldiers, but by the lengths it will go to save them. The choices made by nations and their soldiers have consequences that echo through history. If you want to continue exploring these critical comparisons, subscribe to WW2 Explained and let us know in the comments which historical duel we should examine next.